I'm Stephen. Good morning. Welcome to church this morning, especially if you're here for your first or second time. We were due back in Revelation today, and partly because of my ongoing burnout recovery, there was a quick change in plans late on Friday, and I thought, is there a psalm that we can dive into together for a week? I'd spent some time meditating on Psalm 27 the week before last, and I realised we haven't visited this psalm together for 5 years. So Psalm 27 it is. Can you imagine this? Even for great King David, with his heart after God's own heart, even for great King David, one of the chief and most dangerous temptations that he faces again and again and again is to become so distracted by everything that's going on around him, especially serious, heavyweight opposition and conflict that he faces. The temptation is that he becomes so distracted that he takes his eyes off the living God, in whom rests all his hope. That's the temptation. If that's true for David, that there's this temptation of being distracted from God, well, how much more so for average Ben Israelite? I have a question. What kinds of things have power to distract you from God? And I'm going to give you 90 seconds to chat with someone who's sitting just nearby you. What kinds of things in your life have power to distract you from God? And I just want you to have a quick discussion. I'll give you 90 seconds. If you're watching this at home, you might want to write things down. If you're watching this on the video someday in the future, again, write things down. But here in the room, I'll give you 90 seconds and just talk among yourselves. What kinds of things have power to distract you from God? Okay, go. I'm sorry to stop those conversations. Here are some of my own answers to that question. What kinds of things have power to distract you from God? Low grade but almost handleable trouble. The kinds of troubles that I think I've got this, and I forget to turn to God. Depending on how it comes about, some kind of fierce conflict, and I become consumed with how I respond, whether well or badly. Sometimes deep fears, maybe this is for you, deep fears about my own security or my own significance. Uh, the trivialities of television or social media or shiny celebrity worship, there are very shallow things that can distract from God. Relationship stresses or health stresses, those are not necessarily so shallow at all. Some just sheer busyness with really good projects, really worthy projects, challenging um, challenging projects or even hobbies. There are things that can distract from God. Also, there are unworthy desires and lusts of the heart. David is perfectly familiar with all of that, well, almost all of that. Reading between the lines, some imagine that one possible moment when this psalm may originally have been used might have been a grand ceremony on each anniversary of his coronation. Well, that may be the case. Whether or not that's correct, here's a simple structure, a simple way of thinking. How does this psalm fit together? First, there are two stanzas, and there are things that David wants to declare to or redeclare to his people, reaffirm to his people, and they're voiced in the third person. They talk about God as He. Then in verses 7 to 12, there's a direct prayer to the living God, and it's in the second person, you. And then the final short stanza, verses 13 and 14, could be to the people again, though I suspect it's actually primarily David speaking to his own heart. It's in the first person, I. And it's an exhortation to stiffen his courage, come what may. We're going to spend most of our time in the first 6 verses, though we are going to cover the whole psalm. The underlying challenge is that one of the top temptations that David faces again and again and again is to become so distracted by all those welcome and unwelcome, all-consuming circumstances around him, so distracted that he takes his eyes off the living God in whom rests all his hope. That's the temptation. And once he takes his eyes off God, then he has every reason to be fearful. And that's why we have in front of us such a passionate, eloquent, kingly psalm of confidence, even amid difficulty. Let's begin with the first stanza, verse 1. Do you catch the opening vibe here? The Lord is my light and my salvation. So light even in darkness, salvation even amid trouble, difficulty and distress. The Lord is my light and my salvation. Whom shall I fear? The Lord is the stronghold of my life, that is, even amid profound weakness or disorientation or conflict. The Lord is the stronghold of my life. Of whom shall I be afraid? Maybe at this point already I should go onto a sidebar. Do you notice how the poetry works? There's a technique being used here which is known as parallelism. When you're writing poetry in English, one of the basic techniques is to make sure that that you use rhythm and rhyme and you echo from line to line to line. So, an example, there was movement at the station, for the word had passed around that the colt from old Regret had got away and had joined the wild bush horses. He was worth £1,000, and we could keep going with Banjo Paterson. And you can hear the rhythm echoing from line to line. It actually feels a bit like a horse galloping. Or we can echo sound. So, twinkle, twinkle, little star, how I wonder what you... and it has to rhyme. And that's the way poetry works when we're writing in English. In Hebrew poetry, there was also echoing of rhythms and echoing of rhymes, but when you translate into other languages, most of those are lost. But that's okay, because in Hebrew poetry, more important than the echoing of rhythms and the echoing of rhymes is the echoing of ideas. From line to line to line. That's how Hebrew poetry works. And so if you're writing poetry and you're echoing ideas, well, you could even try writing your own. I had a little crack. A telescope view on a cold, clear night. For those crazies who care to look, shivering moonshine. And there are 2 lines there, and thoughts from one line are echoed in the next. I'm so thankful. I think of it this way. If Hebrew poetry works the way most English poetry works, then translating that poetry into other languages would be pretty much impossible. Because obviously when you translate, you lose rhythm and you lose rhyme. But God graciously, kindly arranged to give us poetry that's translatable, and when it's translated, it's still the same poetry. Even when it's been translated, you can translate into English or into Mandarin or into Tok Pisin, where I grew up, or you can translate into Macedonian, and the poetry still works the same way, because from line to line you still have that echoing. So here it is in verse 1, the Lord is my light and my salvation, whom shall I fear? And then those ideas get echoed. The Lord is the stronghold of my life. Of whom shall I be afraid? Keep reading. When evil men advance against me to devour my flesh, When my enemies and foes attack me, I'm picturing a pack of apex predators here, they will stumble and fall. Though an army besiege me, my heart will not fear. Though war break out against me, even then will I be confident. Now, make no mistake, this is the voice of experience. David knows trouble. David knows all-consuming trouble. If you scan through his storyline at different points, he personally is pursued by the armies of Saul. At other points, he has to stand against the Philistine menace attacking from the west. At other points, he has to stand up against Ammonite threats attacking from the east. He also has hostile internal politics that he has to deal with. David seriously knows trouble, the kinds of troubles that has potential or power to distract him from the living God. And what he says in this psalm is, even in darkness, even in distress, even in difficulty, even in deep trouble, if I know and fear the Lord of hosts, then I have no one to fear. If I love the Lord of hosts, then there's nothing else that can shake me. And so you see in David this beautiful, humble fearlessness, don't you think? He effectively says, regardless of what circumstance I might find myself in, I will not be shaken. Regardless of circumstance, my confidence remains. Because my confidence is not just in myself and in my resilience. Resilience is a great thing, but in the end, my resilience is still just frail human resilience, and it will fail at some point. My confidence, he says, is not in my own resilience, and he is known as a mighty warrior. But that's not where he finds his strength. Nor is his confidence in his circumstances and kind of think positive and hope for the best. He says, my confidence is in the Lord. He is the stronghold of my life. He is my salvation. He is my light. If you know God truly, if you know that you are permanently his, well, what else is there to fear? Whom else can possibly make you afraid? The temptation, of course, is to become so distracted by everything going on around you that you forget to keep your gaze on the living God in whom rests all your hope. That's the real temptation. David himself never got to read these lines from Paul, but I think he would have heartily agreed. Paul, our apostle, writes, "Who shall separate us from the love of Christ? Shall trouble or hardship or persecution or famine or nakedness or danger or sword?" There are so many ways of being distracted and afraid. As it is written, "For your sake we face death all day long. We are considered as sheep to be slaughtered." No, in all these things we are more than conquerors through him who loved us. That's Paul's way of saying, if you know God truly, and if you know that you are permanently his, why be shaken? Whom else is there to fear? And this beautiful, humble fearlessness is not based in the self. It's not based in the power of positive thinking. And we can do this, can't we? This beautiful, humble fearlessness is based in the living God. Last century in the Western world, this is the kind of fearlessness that was needed, especially by pioneer missionaries. taking the gospel of Christ into new lands. In the century ahead, I think this is the kind of fearlessness, certainly that will be needed by every pastor and every evangelist, but I think actually this is likely what will be needed by every faithful follower of Christ. This fearlessness. I need not be distracted. I can focus on the living God. And when I do, I need not fear. David then leads us into this far-reaching question. If you could ask God for just one thing, what would that one thing be? And why? Now, we could easily spend time discussing that amongst ourselves again. We won't this time. It's a big question. If you could ask God for just one thing, what would that one thing be? To pray David's answer is incredibly challenging. Because I'm guessing for most of us, most of the time, there are alternatives that we have on our personal list of one. I'm guessing if we could ask God for just one thing, maybe health, maybe safety, maybe protection, maybe success, not mediocrity, maybe a single compelling purpose for my life, maybe a community where I deeply belong, maybe justice, either for myself or for others, maybe on that top prayer point list of one, maybe wisdom. Maybe I'd pray for wisdom. Could it be courage in living for Christ? What is the one thing that your heart craves? Or that you imagine, if you could just have that one thing, it might change your life? What is it that you dream might bring satisfaction? What top prayer point is on your own secret list of one? Maybe it's someone's approval. Maybe it's standout accomplishments and recognition. Maybe it's control over some particular area of life. It could be comforts or pleasures. It could be forgiveness. It could just be no regrets. It could be, I want to feel as though I'm included in this social circle and I feel as though I'm on the outside looking in. Or I feel, or I want to be included in this professional circle and not feel like an outsider. It could be simply, oh Lord, I want there to be people who need me. Or freedom from some besetting sin. Could be burnout recovery completed. It could be the prayer to feel secure again. If you could ask God for just one thing, I wonder what that one thing might be. David makes one holy request. David knows that whatever he's facing, be it political aggro or political conflict or personal darkness and weakness, this is the single thing that he most needs. And it's the single thing that his people need him to have. Above wisdom, above security, above love, above forgiveness, and all those other possibilities, I wonder, is there anything quite so laser focused as this in the entire Old Testament? David says, "O Lord, I long to dwell permanently in your presence." That's his top request. Verse 4, "One thing I ask of the Lord, this is what I seek." that I may dwell in the house of the Lord all the days of my life. That is, amid all the other things that threaten to distract and consume him, he knows this is the single thing that he needs most. Above all those other competing priorities, he needs to gaze upon the beauty of the Lord and to seek him. I would say it, he needs to be preoccupied with who God is and what God wants. He needs, above all else, to be preoccupied with who God is and what God wills. Now, for David, I think he's looking beyond the portable tent of meeting that they had been using ever since the days of Moses. I think he's looking forward. He's even looking beyond the solid temple that his son Solomon would soon start building. He's looking beyond the earthly shadows into the glorious heavenly reality. He cries out elsewhere. I've got a bunch of psalms here. Psalm 26, I love the house where you live, the place where your glory dwells. Or Psalm 63, this one has become very precious to me. O God, you are my God. Earnestly I seek you. Psalm 23, I will dwell in the house of the Lord forever. There are more beyond the Psalms of David. How lovely is your dwelling place, O Lord Almighty. My soul yearns, even faints for the courts of the Lord. My heart and my flesh cry out for the living God. Psalm 42, as the deer pants for the water, so my soul longs after you. What does the deer do? The deer just keeps coming back again and again and again to the water brooks because the deer knows he needs it. Psalm 73, whom have I in heaven but you? There is a deeper question. What am I really made for? Augustine, a passionate North African thinker and leader in the late 4th century, put it this way. He said, O Lord, you have made us for yourself, and our hearts are restless until they find their rest in you. Which was actually part of a beautiful prayer that I got to pray early this morning. O Lord, our hearts are restless until they find their rest in you. That's what I'm made for. To find my rest in God. The problem is, too much of the time, I'm far too easily satisfied by third-rate earthly toys and experiences and attractions and distractions, and I allow my heart to settle for temporary satisfaction in things that are passing away, rather than seeking the ultimate and permanent satisfaction for which I was made. C.S. Lewis, with his poetic heart in the mid-20th century, wrote it this way. He said, we are far too easily pleased. We are far too easily pleased. we fool around with drink and sex and ambition when infinite joy is offered to us. David knows my ultimate source of satisfaction is also my ultimate source of safety. And the other way around, my ultimate source of safety is equally my ultimate source of satisfaction. And what am I made for? I am made to behold and cling to the glory and grace of God, eyes filled with his majesty, heart at rest in his goodness. That's what I'm made for. And so David knows, I can't afford to become so distracted that I take my eyes off him in whom rests all my hope. And in fact, he knows, because of his role as king, my people can't afford me to become so distracted by everything going on around me that I take my eyes off him in whom rests all my hope. I can't afford that. They can't afford that. The costs are too high. Verse 4, one thing I ask of the Lord, this is what I seek, that I may dwell in the house of the Lord all the days of my life, to gaze upon the beauty of the Lord and to seek him in his temple. For in the day of trouble, David knows trouble, in the day of trouble he will keep me safe in his dwelling. He will